Hello and welcome to another video. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the Daedra, the Daedra, and the Magna-Ge in the Elder Scrolls in order to help you run them and their presences in your own campaign on tabletop. So, to that end, I'm going to be talking about some of the backstory with Lorkhan and the creation of the different gods of the universe of the Elder Scrolls. And I'm also going to be going in on how you should roleplay these various beings and how you want to use their story in your own campaign. So, with that aside, let's just get right into it. Ages and ages ago, before the creation of Tamriel, Nirn, or even Mundus, the universe itself, there was a primordial darkness in which existed the Et-Ada. The Et-Ada are unfathomable beings of a spiritual, metaphysical nature who can assumedly take on any form and wield any caliber of power they choose. These beings had no distinctions between them, so you're not thinking of Daedra and Daedra. These are just spirits who can embody whatever they choose. There's very little known about them, of course, since they're so ancient. One of these spirits was known as Lorkhan, and Lorkhan had the idea for a disputed reason. There's a few different theories on that. Decided to create a plane of existence, but didn't have the full power to do so by himself. In order to remedy this problem, he approached the Daedra and asked them to assist him in creating this new plane. The Daedra were split on how to respond to this and fell into three camps. The first being the Daedra, who agreed to help Lorkhan with the creation of Mundus, the Daedra, who refused, and the Magna-Ge, who participated for a time with the Daedra but eventually grew disillusioned with Lorkhan and ceased to help at a certain point. Lorkhan did not inform any of these spirits that their power would indeed be consumed, not just used, in order to create Mundus. Once these gods used their power, they would no longer be able to be extremely powerful as they once were. Now, one thing you might be thinking from this is, wouldn't that make the Daedra much more powerful than the Daedra or Magna-Ge? And you are correct. Yes, the Daedra are just simply more powerful. And that's an important thing for your campaign, because that means that you are necessarily running a world in which the forces of evil are stronger than the forces of good with just basic numbers. The Daedra are more powerful. They didn't use their power to create Mundus. And so they are just simply an overwhelming force that cannot be countered. Now, there's no accounting for mortals and, of course, the plot of your campaign, but the status quo in the Elder Scrolls, interestingly enough, is one in which evil is completely on the rise and cannot be stopped. Continuing with the story, Magna-Ge, Daedra, and Daedra split into these three groups. When the Daedra and Magna-Ge learned that Lorkhan was using their power to create the plane and hadn't informed them of this, they had a few different reactions. The Daedra decided to go the murder route, and they ripped Lorkhan to pieces, destroying his body and throwing his heart into their new creation. Sort of a ironic twist, you might say. The Magna-Ge just decided to stop helping earlier because they kind of suspected things and went their own way. They maybe created or just went to a new plane called Aetherius, and they ripped a hole in Mundus on their way out. And that's the sun in the Elder Scrolls setting. So the sun is actually a giant portal to a different plane of existence called Aetherius. And Aetherius is a plane of pure magical energy. After this, the Daedra came to be seen as antithetical to the mortal planes, even though their only sin was really not wanting to help Lorkhan. The Daedra are not simply evil, but rather they are opposed to the existence of the mortal plane. They see it as the result of an immoral act, that being theft by Lorkhan. And so the Daedra see it as their right to destroy this realm, as recompense for Lorkhan's attempted deception of them and successful deception of their fellow Daedra, the Daedra and Magna-Ge. The Daedra, for this reason, are extremely hostile to the mortal plane Mundus, and of course the world of Nirn, which is inside of Mundus. Tamriel on Nirn in Mundus. The Magna-Ge are a little more neutral. They represent the forces of magic, which have been alternatively used for good and evil throughout the ages of Tamriel, and they tend to take a neutral stance on things. We don't really know much about the Magna-Ge because the only member we know is Magnus, the leader, and other than that, we don't even have any other names. So they're quite mysterious. If you remember playing through the College of Winterhold questline in Skyrim, you will have had some contact with the Magna-Ge through the Eye of Magnus, but even that quest is fairly vague as to what the Magna-Ge even are. We're not really sure if they function the same as the Daedra, maybe more like the Daedra, more like the dragons. Nobody's really quite sure. In the aftermath of this, Nirn was created, with the Daedra inhabiting their new plane with vastly reduced powers. It's speculated that they may even have become mortal as a result of expending their powers, and actually became the first humans, elves, and other races to inhabit Nirn and populate it with its people. So, with that story out of the way, how should you incorporate the Daedra, Daedra, and Magna-Ge into your campaign? What are some interesting ways to get them in there, and how should you portray them? Well, I'm going to split this into three categories, pretty obvious ones: the Daedra, the Daedra, and the Magna-Ge. And we're going to start with the Daedra, who are probably the easiest to work in there. The Daedra are hostile to the mortal plane, and they feel that their reasons for being so are justified. They provide mortals with certain artifacts which they can use to work chaos throughout the world and do evil deeds, evil by our standards, of course, good by their standards, and justified because of Lorkhan's actions. Now, in a lot of other settings, I would say do not have the Daedra be part of it. They're too powerful, they're too ancient. But in the Elder Scrolls, that is not the case. The Daedra show up all the time in the games and all the time in the story directly, and it works. So I would say you should totally go for it. It's well evidenced in the setting, and it's not a crazy thing to do at all. In fact, it's very common. There's many quests in every single game that feature them. So for that reason, you want to have the Daedra show up because it's more true to the games, and you want them to be part of the plot in some way. Because oftentimes these quests are the most memorable or the most rewarding, or both. Daedra, upon completing their quests, often reward those who serve them with an artifact, which sort of represents their MO. Now, how should you portray the Daedra when they show up? I would say there are two schools of thought here, either of which is really cool. You can portray them more like they are in the games and have them be the most refined version of their trait. So, Sanguine is like a drunken reveler, and he's like the most drunken reveler you could ever be. Clavicus Vile is like the most deceiving, scheming person you can ever be. And Boethia, the most traitorous, treacherous person that you could ever imagine. Now, what you want to do with this is you really want to lean into just how extreme these traits are. You want to call attention to your players that this person's sanguine, his breath doesn't just smell like alcohol and he's kind of wacky. Maybe even his form is shifting slightly with just how chaotic and crazy he is. Or maybe he is like shape-shifting super fast in front of them, where like it's just causing people to go insane, basically. For Sheogorath, you don't want to just have him be doing wacky stuff. In addition to that, you want to have him be like slowly driving the players insane. So a great way you can do that is maybe have Sheogorath give off some kind of low whine. Not like he's whining, but whine like a sound. And it just gets louder and louder and louder the longer the adventure goes on, until everybody is like losing their minds. Or for Boethia, you could say that being around Boethia, you just have an automatic distrust of her. Like, without her even saying anything, without even seeing her, the name itself is somehow biologically ingrained into your player's species, and they just can't help but distrust this person. That would be a really interesting element to put into that. You could even transfer that onto their cultist. Maybe there's a cultist of Boethia who has betrayed Boethia and wants to reform, but this association, since the Daedra have been around so long, is so strong that your players cannot even conceive of this idea, or maybe they have to roll a wisdom check to be able to consider this person as they would a normal human. Then there's the second school of thought, and this is the more alien Daedra, where you can just have them act kind of psycho. They don't really talk a lot, and maybe they don't even have a solid form, where they can just like appear anywhere. Maybe they just influence things. They rarely take on human form. Now, this is still within the lore of the games because you can just say that, well, the protagonist of the games is a very special person, and so of course they're going to appear to this person in human form because they're important. But otherwise, maybe they appear more like you would imagine an animating force of reality who was a spirit from beyond time. And you can have them act more like an elder god, where perhaps they're just a whisper on the wind, they have no physical form, they simply affect things and do not directly show themselves. That's a really cool way to do it as well. And I think both ways are really, really cool. So the second category is going to be the Aedra. The Aedra are a lot less involved in Nirn, and that's partially because they have less to do. They're not trying to destroy it, and the plane is going pretty well so far, in my opinion. Um, and also they just have a lot less power. So the way that you can have the Aedra feature in is, I think again, there's basically two schools of thought there. A is divine intervention in big moments in the story. So the Emperor's son is about to destroy Mehrunes Dagon. Akatosh shows up. He becomes a giant dragon avatar and beats him, and it was a crazy fight. Stendar intervenes at a critical moment and destroys a vampire or something that was going to kill one of the players or turn them or something. That's a cool way to do it. You can use them in these big moments because the divines, the Aedra, should be used more sparingly than the Daedra, simply because that's how the games do it, and with the lore, it makes sense. So you can use them at those pivotal moments. And I would say that the second school of thought would be have the divines be more present but less powerful. So don't have them do divine intervention or make it like a once per campaign thing. And instead of having them do a divine intervention when it's a big moment, have them at a shrine, maybe a thought occurs to your player. Don't have the divine speak directly. That might humanize them too much, and you want them to be sort of mythical and godlike. But you can say, as you pray here, a thought occurs to you, which you would not normally have had. Perhaps it's from the divines. And then you can have them sort of intervene in that way, in a more low-key way throughout the campaign, and they can be more present then. I would recommend this strategy if you have a player who is a cleric or somebody who's very devout in the divines, because it's going to be kind of a bummer for them if the only time their guy ever shows up is in these like really big moments, and then other than that, they just don't ever appear. That can be cool for some players, so of course, know your audience. But for a lot of players, they might get like kind of antsy, like when's my guy gonna show up? He's not showing up, what's going on? Is he here? So you don't want your player to lose faith before their player character does. And these strategies can also work together, right? You can have the divines intervene at a low level sometimes, and then for some campaigns, maybe they're far away from any idols or shrines to pray at, and in those, they only show up in big moments. Or maybe you can do both if the divines are a really big part of your campaign. That's totally fine. Thirdly are the Magna-Ge, and this is going to be the hard one. How do you portray Magna-Ge? Well, I'll be honest with you. Again, I think there's two schools of thought, and the first one is not super helpful, and that's don't. The Magna-Ge don't really have a lot of material, and what they do have is extremely vague. So honestly, I would say the first school of thought is don't use them. Just use artifacts from them or like literally one line references and then just don't go into it. Don't have them show up in the campaign. Don't make any names for any of the other ones. Don't mention Magnus. Or if you do, again, just have it be like a single line. So that's one approach. But if you want to use the Magna-Ge, that's not going to work for you, obviously. Or if your whole campaign is based around some aspect of the Magna-Ge, or maybe they're artifacts or something else, obviously that's not going to work. So if you want to use the Magna-Ge, here's my advice. Second school of thought here. The Magna-Ge should be super mysterious and neutral. So if you're looking at an alignment chart here, you want to be looking at neutral, and I'd even say maybe true neutral. The Magna-Ge care so little for either sides of this war between the Daedra and the Aedra mortal plane that they just kind of left and ripped a giant hole in reality, didn't fix it, didn't care. These people are not good, but they're not evil either. So you don't want them to be helping the players free of charge, but you also don't want them to be hindering them and, cackling maniacally. So I would say the Magna-Ge work best as a transactional faction. And what I mean by that is imagine the Magna-Ge more as merchants, because that's what they are. They do things for their own benefit and for their own enrichment. When they found out the deception, they just left, right? Because that's not to their advantage, but they don't really seek revenge because they just don't really care about that. So I would say you should run them as fairly emotionless, fairly mathematical, methodical. They should be sort of cold and calculating, but not evil, because they sort of just do what's to their advantage. If there's a player and they're powerful, they'll support them. They'll tell them the reasons they're supporting them. They'll be very honest with them. They're not going to be like a Daedra where they're going to manipulate you, and they're not going to be like a divine and overpromise. They're just going to be kind of realists, I think. I also imagine them to be quite fickle. They started helping with the project of creating Mundus and then like stopped halfway through. I would say that it's a good idea to run them as sort of self-interested, even to a fault. Like maybe if they crunch the numbers and they come up with whatever situation you're in isn't going to net them any positive outcome, like they're probably just going to stop helping you because it's not to their best interest. The Magna-Ge, in terms of their powers, they are, of course, the gods of magic. And so their artifacts and stuff will usually feature things that maybe give your players more spell slots or act as spell scrolls, or maybe they add effects to pre-existing spells or something like that. So I'd say that for the stuff you want them to be handing out, you want to be giving your players something that's going to be helping their magic, because that's the Magna-Ge's whole thing. Self-interested, probably kind of cynical, fairly neutral on world affairs, just doing things for their own benefit. One quick note at the end here for the Magna-Ge, Aedra, and Daedra. I don't recommend using a stat block for them, even though they do show up a lot. Your players shouldn't be fighting a Daedra Lord one-on-one. I know, the jiggle leg thing, but I don't know. It's not a good idea. I think that if you do have them fight it, you should choose an avatar. Don't use one of like the Demon Lord stat blocks unless it's like something really big, like the Jigglypuff thing, or maybe like a Mehrunes Dagon kind of moment at the end of your campaign or something. I would say usually you want them to take on an avatar that is much weaker than that. Maybe like a thorned devil, or a barbed devil, or an Aussie or something. So that way your players can feel like they've beaten a part of this big villain. So it doesn't feel like they're doing something that doesn't make any sense, but it does feel like they've done something big. All right, and that's what I wanted to talk about for tonight. Thank you for watching. I hope that this will help you run your Magna-Ge, Aedra, and Daedra in your Elder Scrolls games. If you have any other notes about how you think they should be run and what the best interpretation of them is, leave it in the comments. I'd love to read it. I think this is a sort of interesting topic, not just for these gods, but for the gods of other settings as well. So thoughts about other ones are welcome as well. All right, thanks again for watching.